path to get there. Some of you may have attended yesterday a session that we held on the future of sustainable fuels. And so we were quite focused on SAF, where we're going to get it from, how we're going to pay for it, what the ramp up looks like. Today's discussion is much broader. And in fact, we've assembled, I think, a great set of stakeholders and contributors that are coming at this from different angles. And I'll just sort of go around the room quickly. But Paul Stars leads Western regions for Qatar Airways. And so Qatar Airways, of course, is a large consumer of jet fuel and very interested in this from the airline standpoint. It's something that your customers care about a lot, something that your employees care a lot about. And you, of course, are part of the commitment that the industry has made to be net zero by 2050. Val Miflakov is the CEO and founder of Zero Avia. And so you're coming at this from a different angle, which is to use hydrogen as a fuel source, predominantly in regional aircraft for now, but solving an important part of the equation, and a part of the equation that's really quite under attack by government. Government, I think, acknowledges that for the time being, New York to Hong Kong is going to burn fuel, but doesn't acknowledge that New York to Washington or London to Amsterdam has to. And so there's a lot of pressure there, and I think exciting what you're doing. John Gordon, the co-founder and head of partnerships and government affairs at the Universal Hydrogen Company, again, coming at this from an alternative fuels angle. We didn't speak much about hydrogen yesterday, other than to collectively assert that it was part of the answer, more 2040 and beyond, at least in large aircraft, as opposed to tomorrow. But we're looking forward to a challenging conversation on that front. Haldane Dodd, who works for the Air Transport Action Group in Geneva, and so you're coming at this from, I suppose, an advocacy standpoint and an alignment standpoint. And then Fahad Halajian, you're the president of King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, and so I imagine are deep in the question of what the kingdom is doing to contribute to our sustainability goals. I'll start with a couple of comments and then we'll get into questions. First of all, I think it's great that we're having this conversation. I was telling some of you that if I went back to 2018, as the leader of McKinsey's global aviation practice, I get phone calls from CEOs around the industry all the time asking me my thoughts about key topics that are on their minds. And in 2018, I think over the course of the year, I got 5 phone calls from CEOs asking me what I thought about sustainability and whether or not they should think about doing something about it. In 2019, I probably got 10 or 20 calls a month. And so this topic went from something that was in the background to front and center of virtually everybody in the industry's minds overnight. And then, of course, last October in Boston at the IATA General Meeting, the airline industry collectively committed to a net zero target by 2050. Some have asked, and in fact, I got asked yesterday after our panel on sustainable fuels, why the industry was being so assertive about this when it's roughly 2.5% of global carbon emissions and one of the hardest to abate sectors. And of course, what I hear over and over again is an understanding that as other sectors transition, by 2050, if we didn't do anything about it, the industry could be 30% of global emissions. And of course, we are viewed, for better or for worse, by many stakeholders, not as a necessity, but as a luxury. And of course, virtually 2 years of no flying and relatively healthy economic activity around the world, I think proved to some who believe that flying is a luxury. And therefore, we have no choice but to address this. We talked a little bit yesterday about the path. And I think there was a collective concern on our panel that we have as an industry inadvertently given the impression that we're going to get to 2050 in a straight line. And certainly electrification of cars and buses and perhaps even houses may indeed follow a straight line path. I think the physical challenges of propelling 500,000 kilos of airplane 16 hours across the world mean that at best we're going to get there like this. And we are going to have to use a mix of technologies and a mix of techniques and come at this from virtually every angle if we're going to reach that target. And so with that as a backdrop, perhaps, Paul, I'll start with you. From Qatar Airways' perspective, and of course Qatar works with many partners around the world, and so you also have a strong perspective around how other airlines are thinking about it. I imagine some of this is waiting for these technologies to come into view, but what can Qatar Airways do today to start the path towards net zero, and what are you doing?
I think we started looking at this, I think, much further in advance than many airlines. I mean, I'm quite new to the airline, but you know, we started working and following the IATA guidelines back in 2013, which basically looks at it as kind of 4 pillars of sustainability. So the first one is related to technology, you know, so the technology that we deploy, and that means the aircraft that we operate. And obviously we've been looking to continue to invest in new, more efficient aircraft, and that's really a key pillar of what we're doing in sustainability. The second piece is kind of looking at the sustainable aviation fuel. So SAF is really a key pillar for as we stand today, and what can we do in terms of encouraging that whole eco-structure around SAF to kind of scale it up and make it much more widely available. So we've recently committed to some purchases there, and we're committed to 10% by 2030. So that's kind of our target that we're trying to go for, is 10% sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. I think by kind of leading the industry in some of these areas, that really kind of sets a challenge for the rest of the industry to kind of say, look, how do we do that? How do we get on board that, and how do we support that? So those are kind of the key things we're doing for the big ticket items. So, you know, the planes that we operate and the fuel that we burn operating those aircraft. In terms of other things, we're also looking at you know, offset programs. So we've recently introduced a carbon offsetting program for our corporate customers. We've had one for a long time for our customers who are buying through the web and stuff. But we've recently just introduced this for our corporate customers, and we've also joined the cargo CO2 lux piece as well. So for cargo customers, so offsetting is another kind of key part of that. And then the other pillar is looking at our operations. So how can we make our operations more efficient? How do we reduce single-use plastics? How do we make flying more efficient in terms of flight paths and fuel efficiencies and those kinds of things? So internally within the company, we look at it within those 4 pillars.
And you mentioned offsets available for both carbon customers and also direct consumers. You know, one of the grumblings we hear in the industry is that everybody says that they care about sustainability, but nobody wants to pay for it. What kind of uptake are you getting from corporate customers and individual customers on those offsets? So
the corporate one has just recently been introduced. So we're still. It was literally a couple of months ago. So time will tell. And also many corporates are still not flying again since for the COVID crisis. So we expect the uptake to be fairly small. But as we know, corporate travel is a significant part of business travel. So having that in our portfolio, I think, is going to be important. So it's quite small. In terms of the consumer piece, yeah, it is still quite small, but I think that will grow, again, as different consumers come into the aviation market. You know, a lot more younger consumers are coming in who are more concerned about sustainability piece. So we definitely see a stronger pickup with younger consumers coming in.
Great. And Val, yesterday's discussion again was mostly about SAF. And I think there is an increasing view among airlines and perhaps some of the larger OEMs that for 200 seats and above medium and long haul aircraft, SAF is the only solution in our lifetimes. You're betting on hydrogen and are focused a bit more in that middle sector. Why don't you talk a little bit about your views as to why you think hydrogen is the viable path for that slice of the industry, and perhaps beyond.
Of course, and that statement depends on what do you expect the lifetimes, our collective lifetimes to be.
I'm a little older than you are.
Yeah, so we actually think that you can transition to pure hydrogen-based propulsion on all sizes of aircraft within a reasonable amount of time. Now, in aviation, a reasonable amount of time is probably 30 years on the technology basis here. But 30 years is what do we have until 2050, right? And the reason we're so excited about hydrogen specifically, and hydrogen electric or hydrogen fuel cells, is that from the first principles, hydrogen in a pure form is the best fuel, right? So you look at the amount of energy per kilogram of weight, and it is the best fuel, 3 times better than jet fuel. Then people talk about, okay, well, how are you going to store it? You need heavy storage, but actually the cryogenic storage is getting pretty good, and we already have examples in prototype stages that are over 30% gravimetric efficiency, which means, or mass fractions, which means that at the fuel system level, you can store more chemical energy per unit of mass of the tank system than jet fuel, right? So then you can see long-range aircraft with that. The next question is volume, and volumetrically, of course, hydrogen takes more space, but that's where we get to the hydrogen fuel cells as the predominant approach for us, because that's the most efficient way to take that hydrogen, convert it into propulsion. Right? So especially in smaller aircraft, you look at hydrogen fuel cells today, twice as efficient as small turbines. And you're talking about 100-seat aircraft, right? Up to 100-seat turboprops. For example, de Havilland Canada, who's our partner on that size aircraft, that's what we're working with them on. And then similarly, as you go to larger and larger aircraft and you develop the fuel cell technology, it gets better and better, and the efficiency gap remains. What that higher efficiency means is that you need less fuel, you need less volume, and if you do the math, you actually get to the point when you can fly long distances and you need relatively minor changes to the structure of aircraft in order to get there, right? So that's part of why we're excited. The other part is that if you look at sustainable fuels, sustainable aviation fuels, liquid fuels, you're still burning things, and you're still burning them at high altitudes, which means that you have NOx outputs, you have some other, some of the particulate emissions, some of the high temperature water vapor that you can manage. And if you, again, look at the total climate impact, you see that with SAFs, you maybe can offset 40%. With hydrogen fuel cells, you can offset up to 95%. It's not just us, by now the third-party studies and all that, right? So we think over long term, hydrogen electric specifically is the best approach from the first principles. And that means that over time, that's where we get to. So we set up the company to just help the industry get there faster.
Great. You bring up a very important point about SAF, which I think is easily lost. And in fact, I heard many people yesterday in conversations referring to SAF as zero emissions or zero carbon. And of course it isn't. It is burning carbon, and it's burning carbon that if it came from biomass was in the atmosphere recently, and we're putting it back. And so it's therefore referred to as carbon neutral. Whereas the advantage to hydrogen, of course, is that pure hydrogen, when burned, creates no carbon. Great, and you mentioned a 30-year path. Just to bring the audience up to speed as to where that number comes from. If a technology is ready today, and Boeing or Airbus or ZeroAvia decides to launch an airplane, we typically think in terms of a 10-year certification path for an airplane based on new technology. It's another 15 years before you get enough deliveries, maybe 20, into the system to be able to really move the needle. And you add that up and that gets you the better part of 30 years. But that requires the technology to be ready today. Do you think, how far are we from Boeing or Airbus launching, and in OEM vernacular, launching means deciding to proceed with an aircraft of scale based on hydrogen fuel cells?
Yeah, so we think that single aisle scale, so Boeing 737 or Airbus A320, we get to propulsion technology within about 10 years from now that can power that type of aircraft. And then from there, like you said, in reality, these programs will be in parallel, right? So we're already flying prototypes, for example, at ZeroAvia, getting ready to fly our 20-seat prototype, or 19-passenger 20-seat prototype. And the technology is getting de-risked every day. So we already have a number of airframers that are partners. So out of the announced ones, de Havilland Canada is up to 90-seat turboprops. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Regional Jet CRJ division. So already you have these programs starting up. So these manufacturers are committing to utilizing the power plants like that. They're not ready yet, but that's how aviation industry runs, right? Yeah. So we've shown enough for them to be able to commit to those paths. in about maybe 2-3 years, we'll show enough for Airbus to commit to a path for the single aisle and beyond, right? And that's when the parallel paths start. And I think we can get to, with a reasonable certainty, we can get to a point when we meet Airbus aspirations of 0E by 2035, actually having the aircraft of that size flown on hydrogen fuel cells.
Great. John, universal hydrogen, I imagine you're not betting on a single application of hydrogen, but rather the universal use of the fuel as an ingredient in e-fuels, fuel cells, pure hydrogen. How are you thinking about the evolution of those technologies, and what are you doing to get ready for those different futures?
Well, when we talk about hydrogen, I think first you have to understand that the future of aviation is hydrogen.
One way or the other?
One way or the other. It's a question of how the hydrogen is being used. Is it being used in a fuel cell plane, like zero-obvious planes, or our conversion of the ATR? Is it being burned in a combustion engine, like the Airbus demonstrators are planning? Or is it being used power to liquid as a SAF? So regardless of how it's used, the future for aviation is heavily, if not entirely, hydrogen. And why? As Val said, it's very strong from an energy density perspective and can be made entirely sustainable, entirely green. So the future is hydrogen. And I think the future of hydrogen is happening much sooner than McKinsey report or anybody else would suggest. Val and I are flying planes this year, and we're going to be in commercial service in 2025. And when our planes are in the air flying 60, 70, maybe more passengers, the aviation is not going to have an excuse anymore. It's not going to have an excuse that hydrogen is too expensive, because it's going to be at a price in 2025 that looks like it's going to be on par with jet fuel. They can't say that regulators won't approve it or that there's not enough production, because we'll have de-risked hydrogen in aviation. There'll be no more excuses.
And let me double down on the price point. This came up yesterday, but a lot of the numbers that people throw around, SAF is going to be 3 times more expensive than jet fuel. I've heard a variety of price points for hydrogen. All of those estimates were relative to the price for jet fuel in 2019. Jet fuel today is 2.5 to 3 times as expensive as it was in 2019. And we see no demand destruction. And so does that indicate that people are willing to pay a premium, even if, as you say, the curve will come down relatively quickly?
Well, again, I think hydrogen is going to be a price that's equivalent to jet fuel in 2025.
Equivalent to jet fuel as it stands today?
In 2025.
Yeah.
The price, it's a commodity. It's also going to be likely subject to some carbon taxes. And hydrogen will also get the benefit of subsidies at the federal and state level. At that point, hydrogen is on par with jet fuel. Now, whereas SAF, I don't think you could say the same about SAF.
And a lot of the discussion yesterday was about the role that relatively inexpensive sustainable electricity plays in hydrogen scalability, particularly on the SAF side. We see a lot of investment in the end state technologies. There's a lot less discussion about the path to sustainable green electricity. Are you concerned about that? Or is that a problem that solves itself?
It's the greatest opportunity the world has ever seen to produce more green electrons from sustainable sources. And I wish that more of our energy and our capital and our government dollars are devoted to that. But you see it going on here in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
You see it here. You see it in Australia with Fortescue, one of our investors. You see it in Washington State, my home, where we're both doing test flights. So I think you're going to see a real shift in the creation of energy over the next decade that's going to disperse the energy production into new places like Australia and Seattle, as well as the wealth, but also enable green hydrogen and our planes.
Great. Exciting. Alden, from an industry advocacy standpoint, what are some of the barriers that you're working to remove, both in the industry and around the industry?
So I think one of the important things is, you mentioned before that the airlines have signed up to net zero 2050. That was the whole industry goal. It wasn't just airlines, it was airlines, airports, aircraft manufacturers as well. We're all focused on the same direction now. And you also mentioned before about how the uptick in interest in this area has been pretty massive, and we've seen that. We've been working on this for 10 or 13 years, and suddenly, during the time of the worst crisis in our industry, there's a real push on this from airlines across the world, but also from the rest of the industry. And that's really been quite heartening to suddenly see all this work that we've done come to fruition, or start to come to fruition. A lot more to go. I think the interesting question as to where do we go? Do we have to go on the SAF side? Do we have to go on the hydrogen side? We need to look at everything that's available. And your point before about using hydrogen either for SAF with power to liquid, or as a propulsion system by itself is an important one. We need to sort of look at that big picture. And what we've done is work out how we can potentially get to net zero 2050, either going down a very high technology route, using hydrogen propulsion, and coming in at the 2035 angle, or if that doesn't work, what is the backup? We need to make sure that there's a backup plan, and that is sort of shifting to SAF if the hydrogen question doesn't work. But I think we're all fairly confident and growing more confident by the day that actually there's some real opportunities that exist in the hydrogen space. What are some of the barriers that exist? One of them, I think, from our perspective, is we need to make sure that governments are on board with this. Because even though we've signed up as an industry, and we can certainly do a lot as an industry by ourselves, we need the right policy environment, whether that be on the hydrogen side, whether it be on the SAF side, or general technology or operational issues, or air traffic management issues as well. We need governments to back that up as well. We're going to be asking governments this year at the ICAO Assembly to also back up a long-term goal, and hopefully that provides some investment stability at least, so that we can start going to the investment community and saying, hey, we've got this objective we need to reach. The world's governments through the United Nations have said so. We as an industry have said so. How can we get the financing to make that happen, and the policy environment to make that happen, whether that be on any of the different levers that we can pull.
Yep. And on that point, I mean, obviously, everyone that's in this space recognizes that we need both a demand signal and a price signal. Of course, they're related in order to make the transition and solve the chicken and egg problem. I was surprised by something you said, John, which is that your assumption is that hydrogen fuels will be subject to carbon tax. And
No.
Oh,
Fossil fuels.
Okay,
yeah.
sorry. Now I understand your point.
Hydrogen
It's a
will get
much
the
less
benefit of
interesting
incentive.
point for me to dig on now
Hydrogen
that
will
I
get the
understand.
benefit of incentives.
Okay, good. All right, very good. Let me switch, Fahad. I think many of us look at the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and say there is no country in the world that is better positioned to lead the charge on renewable fuels. You have an enormous economic incentive to move away from petroleum over the long run. You have a privileged geography, you have the land, and you have a bold and ambitious policy environment that allows for relatively fast-tracked development, as witnessed by Vision 2030 in the industry and everything we're seeing today. How is that vision being manifested in the energy sector? And how are you spending research dollars and early-stage technology to be able to create the green energy required to fuel John and Val's airplanes?
So first, let me thank you for having me here. And just before I start, let me explain that CapStark is a non-profit advisory think tank that looks to advise both domestic as well as international and global policymakers. So when it comes to Saudi Vision and last year with the Saudi Green Initiative, we saw a lot of concrete targets that have been set for the sustainability part, including the focus on energy sector. So the ambition to reach net zero by 2060, and in the meantime, being the largest producer of low carbon hydrogen or clean hydrogen by targeting an ambition to produce 4 million tons, which is equivalent to more like 20 of the existing or the planned NEOM project. There is also an ambition to supply the grid to be 50% renewable. But I would like maybe to go back to the point you raised about the aviation sector, and for 2 years that we did not, or we managed through without the aviation sector or without flying and maybe it being a luxury. I actually think that the 2 years that we endured actually stressed the importance of the aviation sector. For a lot of people, it meant, the difference between life and death, and having the vaccine, having the necessary, medical supplies, And so I would think that the aviation sector is actually one of the more essential sectors. We also see it as part of Vision 2030 as one of the essential growth sector, where both it's, as one of the sectors that should enable tourism and the growth of tourism in the country. But going back, I think it's very important that the aviation sector learns from the other sectors and doesn't make the same mistakes. I think over the past 2 years, I've been listening and talking to a lot of policymakers. I've been at COP26. I've seen the discussion leading up to COP26 and the discussion following COP26. And I think it's very important that we, both as an industry, but also I think as global citizens, make sure that we look at all the solutions. And I don't think there is a single, solution. There is no silver bullet. And so it's not either or, it's all of the above, and we need to do more of it. So when we're looking at hydrogen, when we're looking at sustainable aviation fuel, but when we're also looking at low carbon fuel, when we're looking at operation, when we're looking at engine, lightweighting, all of these things, we need to do more of the above. And I think one of the essential things is how do we, involve our supply chain as an aviation sector? And so working with the manufacturer of current jet fuel, how to reduce their emission. Because yes, sustainable aviation fuel is going to help, and the same thing for hydrogen and electric airplanes. However, if we want to make an impact at a huge scale and not wait for 2050, we need to work on current jet fuel. How can we reduce the emissions that are coming from this? And we just need to look at the lesson of the US. The greatest reduction that came in the US over the last 15 years did not come from electrification, did not come from EV, did not come from hydrogen. It came from the boom in shale gas. And so the perfect cannot be the enemy of the good. And we need to look at incremental steps and not confuse the long-term vision, which is admirable and we need to achieve it, with the short-term target. And because the aviation sector, as everyone knows, and in my experience with the energy sector especially, it's a long-term discussion. When we're talking about investment, we're not talking about investment that is going to happen in 2 to 3 years. We're talking about decades and the impact we're going to have in those decades. And so we need to make sure that we're hitting all of the targets, all of the possible solutions. And so I think that's very important. And I think Saudi is trying to lead this. Just 3 months ago, Saudi signed actually 8 memorandum of understanding between the Ministry of Energy and a lot of the users of hydrogen and trying to promote hydrogen use within the domestic, whether it's in the aviation sector or within the domestic mobility in buses, cars, and so on. But also I think we see our role, and Saudi sees its role as a global exporter of hydrogen and clean energy, enabling other countries that don't have either the capacity, the land, or the low cost and efficiency that Saudi can have in generating low carbon hydrogen and other forms of energy, like Japan, like Korea, like the European Union. And I think we need to be sure that we reach out, factor in international collaboration, and make sure that it's not my vision or your vision. We have a very inclusive vision that take into account not only one country or one set of view, but it's inclusive. And I think this is what should be the lesson that we had from COP26.
I want to dig on a couple of points that you made. First of all, just to clarify, I 100% believe that the aviation sector is essential. I am parroting what I've heard from multiple governments who would love an excuse to decide that it isn't, and I think COVID may have given them that excuse in some cases. Second, I think we all agree that we have to do everything we can today, and there are some relatively large levers available to us that are political problems, not physics problems. A single European sky would probably be the fastest single chunk of carbon to come out of, or emissions to come out of the industry, and yet that is a political problem today. That's not a technology problem. But you said that we need to place multiple bets and concentrate on no one thing. Something that I'm hearing from a lot of people is that might have been true 5 or 6 years ago, but that we now have the acuity to understand the mix of technologies that are likely to play a role in the 2050 outcome, and it's time for us to double down on not many, but a few. And so, for instance, there's no one here that's advocating for battery-operated 300-seat aircraft. And is there anything, by the way, that a battery-operated aircraft in the 20-seat range can do that a hydrogen fuel cell-operated airplane couldn't?
Is that a question?
Yeah. Sorry.
No, actually, we think that the useful boundary is even lower. And the useful boundary is not just in the size of aircraft, but also in the utilization. So you have two distinct challenges in batteries. One is the energy density, or specific energy, more precisely, so kilowatt hours per kilogram. And the second challenge is cycle life. And those two electrochemically are trade-offs, right? So you typically don't have both of them at a very high level. So for a commercial aircraft, you need both at a high level, right? You need a lot of energy, and you need it to be able to cycle, let's say, a regional aircraft 10 times a day.
Yep.
And for a 20-seater, it's just not happening, right? So we think the useful boundary is even below that, maybe at a 6 to 10 seats, and maybe more sporadic use than a typical regional carrier. So really, hydrogen, the way we see it in the long term, is hydrogen is taking larger and larger percentage of the total sustainable aviation, and displacing sustainable aviation fuels over time.
John, same view?
Yes, I would even include eVTOLs in the hydrogen equation, particularly because if what's really important for eVTOLs is fast turnaround time. And it's going to be very hard for these eVTOLs to turn around quickly and be profitable with batteries. Hydrogen, with our drop-in tanks, you could turn around the eVTOL pretty much instantaneously. So I think there's a really broad use for hydrogen going to the smaller planes, but also again going to the larger planes through combustion for the narrow and wide body.
Got it. And yet there's a very clear application right now for electrification in, let's say, ground service equipment, and that would fall into the category of things that we can do today. Where is that on the list of things that Qatar is pushing? The greenification of airports and airport services.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think we definitely endeavour with the airport to minimise carbon use as well through electric use as well. Yeah. But the difficulty is, of course, when you're a hub operator, you can do things with your hub, but when you look at doing things outside at the other end of the routes, you're reliant on other providers to provide those services in piece. But certainly, it's a key aspect of what we're doing at the hub.
And Paul had earlier told me that they were having trouble finding cleaners at some of your outstations. So if that's a challenge, I imagine getting electric ground service equipment is a greater challenge still. What else is on the list for Qatar Airways over the course of the next few years in terms of things that can be done today that will reduce fuel usage and improve the carbon efficiency of your operations?
I think a lot of those things are taken care of through fleet renewal, because as you replace some of the older aircrafts with the newer ones, which are made of the composites, the efficiencies are automatically there. So fleet renewal is really a key aspect of that. And we were discussing on the SAF piece as well. I think we really need to push that and see where we can get greater availability of SAF. But the problem there is the production piece and the time to market and the scalability of that piece. So, we're pushing and working on all these aspects and areas. So those will be the key focus for us.
Yep. Good. We've got about 10 minutes left. I thought I might hand over to the audience if there are any questions for our panelists, or comments or answers to any of the questions that I've raised. Yes, please.
The question is to Zero Avia and to the other gentleman with the airline. One of the key issues is, if you're going to use hydrogen as a fuel, how are you going to make sure that when you land, there is sufficient hydrogen to refuel? Because it's not only the plane, it's also the airports that need to be converted to hydrogen hubs. It's an integrated supply chain. It's not single.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start, and I'm sure you'll have perspectives as well. So that's why actually at Zero Avia we also looked at the infrastructure very early on. And in fact, actually today we made additional announcements around that, new partnership with Shell which is, of course, the largest aviation fuel supplier worldwide, that is partnering with us to ensure that there is sufficient amount of hydrogen and at the right price at the airports. Right, so we're looking at specifically a distributed production of fuel, ideally green electrolysis based on green electricity from local renewable power, and that's where we're very excited about what's happening here in the region, of course, and in the country here with NEOM projects and some others. And that will be the model for us to ensure that there is available fuel at the right price at the airports. And some of the architectures that we're talking to specific airlines, and we have several launch partners now, Alaska, United, and some others, Amazon out of the cargo. We're looking at their networks, and depending on how big the node is, how many packages it flies, or how many people it flies, we have various levels of infrastructure to put there. So that architecture or blueprint is already developed, and as John mentioned, we are looking at 2025 definitely on par cost per seat mile or ton mile compared to jet fuel.
Yeah, hydrogen aviation is not new. Pratt & Whitney was doing it and working on it in the 50s. The Russians flew the Tupolev in the 80s. The excuse has always been the lack of infrastructure. We solve that. Universal hydrogen solves that in a fairly novel way, which is to make the fuel tank modular, which means that we can fill up the fuel tank at the source of production. We can be strategic in where we purchase the hydrogen, and we deliver it to airports through the intermodal freight network using electric or hydrogen trucks. And right now what we're doing with our 13 airline launch customers is looking at their airport network and figuring out where the hydrogen production can be and the cost of distributing sufficient hydrogen to all the airports. So infrastructure is not an excuse anymore for hydrogen.
Other questions? Please. Sorry.
Hi. I come from a commercial background to the airline. I'm not an engineer, but I just wanted to understand if we want to change to hydrogen, do we need to change the engines, or it can be actually converted to hydrogen, just to look at it from a cost perspective? Thinking that the airline has to change all their engines to be a hydrogen, or it actually an easy conversion and a less cost, because that's definitely will be an incentivized thing for the airline to actually join the hydrogen club. Let's go.
Well, sure. So we're offering the hydrogen powertrain, fuel cell-based powertrain as a retrofit kit for existing Dash 8s and ATR 42s and 72s. And that will be a swap of the engine, but most of the all of the turboprops go through an engine overhaul in their normal maintenance cycle. It will be around the same cost. So that's the case for turboprops. I'd like to see a similar powertrain kit for single aisle planes, but that is likely going to be a combustion hydrogen engine, which hasn't been done yet. But Safran, who's here this week, is working on that, as is Pratt. Pratt just got a very big $3 million research and development grant from the U.S. government to work on it. I mean, much more money needs to be devoted to this project of how we're going to combust hydrogen in engines, how the engines need to be modified. The Tupolev was a modified Jet A engine, so it has been done. It can be done, but to me, that's probably the biggest barrier to really unleashing hydrogen in the larger planes.
Great. Another question over here.
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick question. If aviation contribution to the environment is 2%, why the big fuss?
So I can start on this one. So the 2% or 2.5% to be exact is a CO2 only number, right? So if you take the carbon sort of footprint overall, human climate impact from carbon footprint specifically, that's maybe 2.5% today. Now, there is a consensus today that carbon is not the entirety of it for aviation because of the high altitude emissions of various pollutants, you're looking at actually anywhere between 2 and 4x of that. Right, because of those factors. So you're looking, in fact, today, you're looking at 5 to 10% of the total human climate impact. And then on top of that, you have to think about that aviation is actually, pandemic notwithstanding, is one of the fastest growing transportation industries for sure, right, and one of the fastest growing polluters as a result. And then everybody else, as Alex mentioned in the beginning, my previous company was in the EV space, right? And right now it's pretty clear that everything is moving to electric, everything is moving to zero emission on the ground transportation. You have power sector that's decarbonizing very, very quickly. You have buildings that have the solutions, and it's just a matter of deploying them. So you see the trajectory of everybody else getting better and better, and in aviation, we really don't have really scalable solutions. And you look at the lifetime of the vehicles, which is 30 years, then you quickly get to a situation when if we don't do anything, then we can get to the 25-50% of the total in 2050. And obviously, the governments will clamp down on the industry long before that. And that's what we as an industry definitely don't want happening, right? So that's part of the reason why we should push starting yesterday, really.
I think the other part to that is aviation is going to continue to grow, and all the projections are that it's going to probably double or even triple in size over the next 20 years. So we all enjoy flying. We all want to continue flying. So I think that's another key reason, which is it's that today. So if you've got that multiplying and then you've got the rest contracting, suddenly you're looking at a really heavy polluter.
And maybe one more thing to add is that it's very hard to regulate if the industry does not regulate itself, because a lot of these things are cross-border aviation and over international territory, and so it will be very difficult to regulate through national determined contribution that each country would reduce its emission. So it's very difficult to do that, and so I think it's very appropriate that the industry takes the lead on regulating itself and making sure it achieves those sustainability targets.
And as several of you have mentioned, I mean, we have a 30-year path to making a difference. And so if we wake up in 2040 and realize that we're now 20 or 30% of global emissions and everyone's staring at us, we've got 30 years to run if we've done nothing, and the only lever at government's disposal is going to be demand restriction at that point, which is not something any of us want.
I would also just add that people are looking at us now.
Yeah.
It's not like people aren't looking at us because we're only 2%. We're having pressure from our customers. We're having pressure from the investment community as well, getting more and more difficult to get financing for new aircraft, financing for airports development as well, if we don't demonstrate and show and actually achieve carbon reductions as well. Because even though we're 2%, the internet is 2%, Germany is 2%, the UK is 2%. Pretty soon you add up to 100%, and that's the problem. We've got to deal with it. All parts of the industry have to, all parts of the economy have to deal with it.
Well, terrific to hear all of your perspectives. I think the setting here today has been incredibly realistic in terms of the airport analogy. We changed gates at the last minute. We left a few minutes late, but also, as is the case with airlines, sometimes the fact that you left late doesn't mean that you arrive late. And so I've got a few levers at my disposal, and one of them is that I'm going to bring us to a close. So a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much for your perspectives today, and enjoy the rest of the session.